All right, hello all. Welcome. This is going to be ethnicity and ethnic conflict. Um, so, because it's only an 8-week class, I've tried to kind of shrink the readings a little bit. We only have 2 readings a week. They're pretty tough readings because they're journal articles, but everything should be free. Like, you shouldn't have to pay for a single thing for this class, other than, of course, your tuition or whatever. So the first unit we're going to be focusing on, like, what is ethnicity? How do we define it? How does the literature define it? And The class is going to be constructed of 5 papers. Usually the way I handle that is I'll put out the lectures early in the week for the unit. Then I will post the assignments. There will usually be 2 questions. The structure of the assignments are all written papers, 1,500 words, not counting the citations and the headers and all that kind of stuff. 4 legitimate citations. That means no Investopedia or Wikipedia or, please don't put definitions in your paper and try to count them as a citation. Like, come on, this is a senior level college class. I am pretty hard on grammar, punctuation, structure. The reason for this is because it's pretty easy to get a job. You get to clean up your packet, send it in, blah, blah, blah. But, keeping a job for a year is hard, right? And a lot of that depends on your writing level. And so if you're not a good writer, please work on that, right? Use the resources that the university provides, reach out to me for help. The Writing Center is absolutely free, and usually they'll meet you even online, right, on like Teams or whatever. So take advantage of those resources. All right. This is going to be lecture 1, and we're going to go backward, actually. I'm going to talk about the green paper first, Redefining Ethnicity, and then we'll jump into the much tougher paper by Henry Hale. All right, so Green basically just wants to talk about, maybe we need sort of a broad, agreed upon definition of ethnicity, right? And he says, all right, in the introduction, he says, I want to propose a new definition for ethnicity, a very minimalist definition, and then we can sort of start from there and see if we need to add to it, right? And so he says, I'm going to propose this definition is based on 3 core components, right, that are sort of interspersed in all the literature. So the first is going to be common descent, right? Like we're from the same maternal line, right? The second is going to be common history, right? So we share culture, history, um, generally socio-demographics, things like that. And the third that he says is important and is a difference from the former literature, especially a former Fearon paper that he cites heavily in the paper. The third is going to be a common homeland, right? And later in the paper, he'll sort of talk about how this is what really distinguishes ethnicity and ethnic groups from sort of race or caste or these sorts of things. All right. So section 2 is about defining ethnicity, and the literature basically defines ethnicity in 2 different approaches, right? And it kind of depends on which field you're in. So anthropology, sociology, psychology often use what's called the interpretivist approach. And the quote here is that it is a strategy of using a variety of situational definitions suitable to each case study, an approach used by a variety of scholars, especially anthropologists, who are cautious in defining ethnicity outright and prefer to let their subjects define the term. So the interpretivist approach is a little more squishy, right? They basically just say, okay, I'm going to study an individual group. I'm not really going to define what ethnicity is. I'm just going to say that this is an ethnic group, and I'll sort of let you define it based on the contextualization of the group in society, right? But the problem is that this makes comparative research really difficult because if the definition of ethnicity or ethnic group varies across research, how do we compare those research paradigms against each other, right? And that's why this is generally a very sort of case study approach, this interpretive approach. Now, on the other hand, on a more sort of research paradigm from political science and economics, we get the quantoid approach. And there's two subfields basically of the quantoid approach. Originally, there was the quote essentialist, or what we now call the primordialist approach. And this is just the idea that like ethnicity is born into you, it is immutable, it is this sort of ancient kinship structure that exists, right? And it's not really changeable, etc. Um, a lot of the more modern political scientists and economics sort of dismiss this approach for the most part and use what's called the constructivist approach, also known as the instrumentalist approach, right? And this is the idea that ethnic groups and ethnicity are actually sort of artificial constructs, and they are constructed by societal elites for the uses of economics, especially politics, vote garnering, things of that sort, right? And it says the central idea of constructivism is that ethnic groups are artificial and constructed rather than natural and eternal. And just as they can be created, they can also be destroyed or, in the postmodernist vocabulary, fragmented or deconstructed, right? And so ethnic groups are a construct of political elites that they use to sort of whip up fervor and sort of in-group behavior and out-group hatred, right? Okay, so section 3 is about redefining ethnicity. And section 3.1 is about common descent and common history, which are pretty common sort of subcategories of the definitions of ethnicity that already exist, right? So, in just a broader sense of how we understand the word of ethnicity or ethnic group, common descent and common history just kind of fall in line with our common understanding of what ethnicity is, right? And so he's sort of borrowing from Fearon here in Fearon's famous 2000 article. And he says, why would we use these minimalist approaches rather than these sort of very complicated quantoid definitions? And the first is just that it allows us to more easily disseminate information about our research, right? The common understanding of ethnicity, if political scientists and economists have sort of this hyper jingoistic or excuse me hyper jargonistic, not jingoistic, hyper jargonistic sort of approach to ethnicity, it's hard to get across a common understanding to policymakers, legislators, or even just common people about the causes and consequences of ethnicity, ethnic conflict, these sorts of things, right? And so, just sort of pairing the definition and combining it with a common understanding of what ethnicity is should make information just simply easier to disseminate, right? It also allows for an easier operationalization of data. One of the hard things about running analyses and scientific sort of data approaches to ethnicity research is just, how do we define ethnicity and ethnic group? And are these definitions common across different cultural and societal contexts, right? Um, is, say, Romani in Eastern Europe definitionally equivalent to, say, Tamils in Bangladesh, right? These are hard questions to ask. And so, this simplifying and sort of creating a structure for what the definition is makes it easier for us to classify groups and operationalize them in a data sense, right? Which helps to clean up the data. And if we use a minimalist approach, eventually we can sort of clarify further and further. But at least this gives people a complete and clear understanding of what ethnicity is so they can code things. And then finally, there's just conceptual clarity, which sort of goes in with the other two, right? And then finally, the final section, section 3.2, is about the importance of homeland. And he's basically just saying, look, we need to throw out Fearon's former subcategory of conceptual autonomy because it's not clear, it's not useful, and some things that we think of as ethnic groups fall into this conceptual autonomy, and some things that we do think of as ethnic groups commonly fall out of this conceptual autonomy subcategory. So he says, we really need to just focus on homeland. It makes it much more accessible to the public. It makes it much more clear. And it also helps to clean up some of the conceptual and organizational messes, like the difference between ethnicity and race, right? Most theorists don't necessarily really think of Black Americans as an ethnicity in the common understanding of what an ethnic group is. And part of that, as the author points out, is because they don't necessarily really have a homeland, quote unquote. White Americans don't have a homeland, quote unquote, right? Like the United States is a shared geographical unit, and we don't really think of particular regions or areas as white and others as black, right? Um, something could be said about the South or whatever, but largely it's a shared geographical unit, and no one is sort of protecting their quote unquote homeland against other groups. All right, that's all I've got for you for lecture one. Lecture two will be a little thicker, and we'll dive into Henry Hale's Explaining Ethnicity. So thanks for being here, and have a great day.